On June 17, 1953, workers in East Berlin rose up against the East German government in a protest that shook the Soviet Union's control over Eastern Europe. Sparked by harsh working conditions, rising quotas, and demands for political freedom, the uprising quickly spread across East Germany. Thousands took to the streets, demanding democracy, better wages, and an end to dictatorship. But Soviet tanks soon rolled in, crushing the protests with brutal force. Dozens were killed, hundreds were arrested, and the memory of this uprising was nearly erased from mainstream history. In this video, we explore the forgotten Berlin Uprising of 1953, a powerful moment of resistance in the early Cold War that foreshadowed future rebellions in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and beyond. The roots of the rebellion can be traced back to the aftermath of World War II and the division of Germany into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. After the war, the Soviet zone, which included East Berlin, was in economic and physical ruins. The rest of Europe was also in terrible shape after years of total war. But the Soviets had been particularly thorough in destroying anything valuable to them in their occupied zone. It wasn't that they hadn't realized how useful a devastated Germany would be to them in the post-war world. Joseph Stalin famously remarked in 1946, "Germany must be our trusty rear," but instead they had set about turning the nation into their own private Auschwitz. Instead of focusing on reconstruction, the Soviet authorities implemented an aggressive program of land reform, which redistributed large estates to poor peasants. This was done without regard for property rights or the impact on agricultural productivity. They also forcibly collectivized agriculture, merging small farms into larger, centrally managed ones. But this proved to be a disaster. Productivity plummeted and food shortages became widespread. At the same time, the Soviet authorities began a process of rapid industrialization, shifting resources away from consumer goods to military production. This caused severe shortages of basic commodities like food, clothing, and housing. But it was the introduction of new and harsher work quotas that really sparked the unrest. These quotas, which were designed to increase production and meet the demands of the growing arms race, placed an impossible burden on the workers who were already exhausted from years of war and struggling to make ends meet. By June 1953, tensions were at a breaking point. Workers across East Germany were fed up with the oppressive regime, the collapsing economy, and the bleak future that lay before them. They wanted change, and they were willing to fight for it. The uprising began in the working-class neighborhoods of East Berlin. On that day, thousands of workers marched on the city center, carrying banners that demanded an end to the dictatorship. They called for free elections, an end to forced labor, and the right to travel freely throughout Germany. Their demands were simple: democracy, better wages, and the chance to live in freedom. As the protests grew, so did the anger of the crowd. They began to hurl stones and other objects at the police, who responded with batons and dogs. But the people were not deterred. They fought back, determined to make their voices heard. The clashes between the protesters and the police continued for several days, with each side digging in their heels and refusing to back down. On June 20th, the situation escalated when Soviet troops were called in to restore order. The protesters, who had grown increasingly frustrated with the lack of response from the government, saw the arrival of the Soviet troops as a sign of just how out of touch the regime was. They began to chant, "We want freedom, and we will not be slaves." But the Soviet troops were there to put down the rebellion, and they wasted no time in doing so. They moved in with force, beating and arresting protesters and firing on those who refused to disperse. By June 22nd, the situation had largely been brought under control. The streets of Berlin were empty, and the protest leaders had been arrested. The uprising had been crushed. In the aftermath of the uprising, the Soviet authorities took swift and brutal measures to punish those involved. Many of the protesters were arrested and charged with crimes such as treason and sabotage. Some were tortured to extract confessions, while others were simply executed. The crackdown was so severe that many of those who had participated in the uprising were too afraid to even attend the funerals of those who had been killed. The Soviet authorities also took steps to prevent any future uprisings. They imposed strict censorship, cracking down on any form of dissent and keeping the population in the dark about events outside of East Germany. They also increased the size of the secret police force and stepped up its surveillance activities, creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that made it difficult for people to trust one another. In the years that followed, the Soviet authorities worked hard to erase the memory of the uprising from public consciousness. They banned public discussion of the events and removed any memorials that had been erected in honor of those who had died. Instead, they promoted a narrative that portrayed the uprising as a misguided mistake, rather than a heroic act of resistance. They also sought to discredit the protesters, portraying them as enemies of the state who had been manipulated by Western intelligence agencies. Despite the efforts of the Soviet authorities, the memory of the uprising survived, passed down through stories shared by those who had lived through it. In recent years, there has been a growing effort to keep the memory of the uprising alive. Memorials have been erected in honor of those who died, and museums have been created to document the events. There is even an annual ceremony held on June 17th to commemorate the uprising and pay tribute to those who fought for freedom. While the Berlin Uprising of 1953 failed to achieve its immediate goals, it left an indelible mark on the history of Eastern Europe. It demonstrated the limits of Soviet control and the desire for freedom that burned brightly in the hearts of the people. The uprising also foreshadowed future rebellions in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and beyond, showing that the people were not willing to accept life under the oppressive regimes of the Soviet Union. After the crushing of the June 17th uprising, the Soviet Union implemented a policy known as Sonderhaushaltung, which aimed to seal off East Germany from the West in an effort to prevent future rebellions. However, despite these efforts, cultural exchange between East and West Berlin continued. This was partly due to the unique status of West Berlin, which remained an enclave within East Germany and was accessible only through a corridor from West Germany. Despite being separated by an ideological divide, the people of Berlin never lost sight of the fact that they were all Germans, sharing a common language, history, and culture. And despite the efforts of the Soviet authorities to keep the two sides apart, people found ways to connect with each other. Families were separated by the border, and people were forbidden to travel freely between East and West Berlin. But the desire to maintain connections and the lure of the other side was too strong to resist. People found ways to communicate and meet secretly, engaging in a form of cultural diplomacy that went against the wishes of their leaders. In the years leading up to the fall of the Berlin Wall, cultural exchange played a significant role in shaping the attitudes of the people towards the division of their city. For example, the construction of the wall in 1961 led to a surge in creativity among artists and intellectuals in both East and West Berlin. Artists used their work to express their grief over the separation of families and friends and their longing for reunification. Writers wrote novels and poems that explored the psychological effects of living in a divided city. Musicians composed songs that became anthems of the resistance against communism. All of these creative expressions served as a reminder of what was lost when the wall was built and helped to keep alive the hope for reunification. As the Cold War intensified, the Soviet Union tightened its grip on East Germany, making it more difficult for people to travel freely or communicate with the outside world. However, despite these restrictions, cultural exchange continued in more clandestine ways. For example, people on both sides of the wall would gather at the border to listen to music from the other side, dancing and singing together despite the barbed wire and armed guards. These gatherings were a form of resistance against the oppressive regime and a celebration of the shared cultural heritage of the German people. However, it should be noted that cultural exchange was not without its risks. Those caught engaging in cultural exchange with the other side were often punished severely by the East German authorities. For example, in 1972, an East German musician named Wolf Biermann was stripped of his citizenship and expelled from East Germany after he criticized the regime's treatment of its citizens. Nonetheless, people continued to find ways to connect with each other across the divide, demonstrating the power of culture to transcend political boundaries. In conclusion, while the Berlin Uprising of 1953 failed in its initial goal of overthrowing the communist regime in East Germany, it nevertheless had a profound impact on the city and the broader Cold War context. The uprising showed the limits of Soviet control in Eastern Europe and demonstrated the desire for freedom and democracy among the people. Although the Soviet Union was able to crush the rebellion and prevent any further uprisings for several decades, the memory of the uprising survived, inspiring future generations to continue the fight for freedom and reunification. Moreover, cultural exchange between East and West Berlin persisted despite the efforts of the Soviet authorities to keep the two sides apart. The construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 heightened tensions and restricted movement. But it did not stop people from finding ways to connect with each other and celebrate their shared German identity. Cultural exchange became a form of resistance against the oppressive regime and a symbol of the desire for reunification. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and share. And don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this.